Thank you very much, Tim. And if I can invite our panellists to the stage. But first of all, I'll jump right into it by introducing Myron Brilliant, who is coming in from DC on what is Sunday afternoon there. So I thank you, Myron, for making the time for us. Myron is Executive Vice President and Head of International Affairs at the US Chamber of Commerce, which is the world's largest business organization. Under Myron's direction, the Chamber is working to provide strategic direction to advance transparent, rules-based trade and investment policies around the globe. He has a deep reservoir of connection with New Zealand, having attended prior partnership forums and sharing joint interests in lobbying for the TPP, as a number of you would know in this room today. He was here in New Zealand for a partnership forum between the United States and New Zealand when the 2011 earthquake occurred, as indeed was Kurt Campbell, who speaks with us later. He served on the US-New Zealand Council in Washington, which did sterling work to retain and strengthen the bonds of our two countries following the nuclear freeze and before the relationship finally became normalized by political leaders. He has hosted the Prime Minister on a webinar with his members, but particularly also he's an astute commentator on global business affairs and put a particularly astute eye on Washington. Thank you, Myron, and we look forward to hearing from you. Where is he?
Good morning to everyone, and Fran, it's always a delight to be with you. And let me just say, you are a force du jour. I wish I was with all of you in the room today. And I am very proud of the relationship between the United States and New Zealand, and very proud of the relationship I have with a number of you in the room. I saw Michael Barnett do that excellent interview of the trade minister. Michael actually was the person who rescued me in many ways on that fateful time in Christchurch when he so graciously invited me and Susan Schwab, the former USTR, and others into his home in that particular difficult time for the country and for Christchurch in particular. I wish I was back in New Zealand. I want to make a few comments, obviously, about the overall relationship between the United States and New Zealand. But more importantly, I want to talk about the geopolitical environment we're in and focus, Fran, on the trade agenda in particular, where I see opportunity, but where I still see challenges, picking up on some of the themes that were discussed with the trade minister. I also, at the outset, should recognize Mike Hearn and the entire AmCham community that I'm sure is participating in this important forum. I would start by just saying that this is extraordinary times, complex for all of us. We already were dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic. Well, actually, the pandemic is still with us, but hoping to get through the pandemic. Supply chain challenges. Now we're dealing with inflation and many other challenges. Of course, in the United States, we're dealing with rising tensions in the US-China relationship that have global ramifications. Many of you feel it in New Zealand and certainly in the Asia-Pacific region. And then we have the war in Europe, the horrific situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the humanitarian crisis, millions, over 5 million refugees having left Ukraine. And I see the outpouring. And I know in New Zealand, there's been an outpouring of humanitarian support. In the United States, we're tracking well over $600 million. But also what I see that is so remarkable is the robust response from the West, the united front that Europe and the United States has presented. And that front is backed by the business community in Europe and the United States in historic ways. Having been through many other unique moments in history, whether it was dealing with sanctions in Myanmar or Vietnam tensions, or dealing in other parts of the world like Cuba, I have never seen a more robust response from the business community in the United States, with over 400 companies having left Russia since the onslaught of the war. This is the backdrop of your conference, and talking about how we overcome these challenges and promote opportunities like IPAF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is an opportunity. And I think something I'll talk about in a minute in more detail is something that I'm encouraging our government to move forward, not just with New Zealand and Singapore and Australia and of course Japan, But to promote this more effectively with Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia, Korea, and other countries, including India, that sit outside of some of these rules that would benefit all of us together if we advanced progress in areas like the environment and sustainability, if we advance progress in areas like trade through a digital framework, and of course, deal with some other important issues around supply chains. If we can get there, then it's not TPP, it's not the Trans-Pacific Partnership that I came down to New Zealand in 2011 to talk about, but it is better than sitting on the sidelines. The United States currently is part of 14 trade agreements covering 20 countries. In contrast, Europe is part of 46 trade agreements covering 78 countries. China just joined RCEP. China and others are making noises about adding themselves to TPP. The United States has always led on trade, and we cannot afford to sit on the sidelines. And so this conference should highlight the need for a strong partnership with New Zealand and the United States, as well as others. You are, of course, aware of the importance of the relationship for New Zealand. We're a major source of innovation, research, and tourism. We should be expanding opportunities. I heard the Minister of Trade talk about, of course, Amazon and others looking at the market. And U.S. exports support jobs in New Zealand. You know this better than I do. Despite all this, we're not doing enough, I think, to double down on the opportunities that exist, and the risks are high. New Zealand's doing its job. It's partnering as part of the TPP. It's obviously contributing in other ways, but the United States has got to get back in the game. We had a very challenging period on the trade front with high tensions in the U.S.-China relationship during the Trump administration. As Fran knows, I always speak quite candidly. And then we emerged out of that, and we continue to see an isolated United States in many ways. And I know the Secretary Raimondo well, and I know she spoke at this conference, and I know that Kurt Campbell will also be on stage at this conference. Kurt will certainly echo the theme of the United States being back in the game in the Asia Pacific through IPAF, through the participation in Quad initiatives and other things. But we have to back that up with action. Talk is not going to get us there. And so I'm hopeful that the administration over the next few weeks will launch forward with plans to be more specific about what those opportunities on IPAF are. Of course, we have always been promoting certain principles. One, that time is of essence. Let's not wait to get this going. Two, that it's very important that we have variable geometry and, of course, a staggered approach to this so that countries that are not ready to join at the outset can join in later. This doesn't mean not having enforceable standards or not having what I say as very important high ambition standards, but it does mean giving some flexibility to when countries are ready to join the various modules. Third, we've got to institutionalize the consulting process. I think U.S. government's done pretty well. Catherine Tai, Ambassador Tai, Secretary Raimondo have been very open to engagement with our organization, with others. I think we have to do a better job, though. One of the principles that I talk a lot about is educating the Congress and the general public why IPAF is an important step forward. What does it mean for U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific at a time where there's great unrest and uncertainty in the global economy and certainly in Europe? So there's a lot on the table there. We cannot go forward, however, with IPAF if it's just the P5, in my view, unless we find a way to get these other countries involved. To do that, it means being a little bit bolder. Dare say, including maybe some market access in the package, or finding a path forward for market access for these countries that want something tangible, don't want to be told what the labor environmental standards have to be without some quid pro quo. And as the minister said, O'Connor, I think that's very understandable, and it's something we have been nudging our government very clearly on. I'll just end on a couple other quick thoughts. One is that, the United States has been, as we all know, somewhat preoccupied with domestic challenges. The polarization in our country is very problematic. Certainly, we're heading into a midterm election. that will be quite difficult for the incumbent party. This is certainly likely to be the outcome. But America has always found a way to lead in time of global strife and challenge. And I am very proud of the response that Europe and the United States have done together with, of course, our friends in Asia, and particularly, I think, of New Zealand and Australia and Japan, in supporting a robust response to Vladimir Putin. But it's not enough to react to the events of the day. Much more is needed in terms of asserting US leadership. And at a time where economic indicators suggest that inflation's with us for the time being, that supply chain challenges will continue to be present, that we're not out of the pandemic, what better opportunity than to demonstrate leadership through trade and through trade vehicles? And so for that reason, for many other reasons, I'm saying let's get back in the game. Let's move on IPATH. Let's also identify other ways to expand our ability to deal with these supply chain shortages, and frankly, through resiliency and through diversifying supply chains, let's find creative ways to build a partnership with countries like New Zealand that have our shared values, our common interest, and have a similar conviction to the importance of the international system. And make no mistake about it, the international system is fragile and will certainly be challenged by China and Russia in the aftermath of the conflict in Europe and for other variety of reasons. We cannot afford a weakened WTO or an international system that is under assault when we need together to work even more closely to address the myriad of challenges I've identified, the Prime Minister spoke to with force and clarity, and the Trade Minister as well. With that, Fran, back to you. Happy to take any questions with the other panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you, Myron, and we'll take those questions when the two other members of the panel have spoken. It's now my pleasure to introduce Don Braid, Group Managing Director of Mainfreight, a global logistics company listed on the New Zealand Stock Exchange with a market cap of over 7.5 billion. Don's led the expansion of Mainfreight to become a global supply chain logistics provider with operations in 26 countries now, leading a team of close to 10,000 passionate staff around the world. The Mainfreight leadership is known for keeping a close eye on its international operations and global trends. And Don has just returned from a period in the United States, leading a board trip there to look at operations there and those trends. He's known as a straight shooter, tells it as it is, and is well placed to share insights into the global business environment and also later where New Zealand is placed. Welcome, Don.
Thank you, Fran. Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Yes, I have just arrived back from the United States, and I'm sure it's of no surprise to any of you in this room. It is business as usual up there. I attempted to wear a mask and not shake hands or give anybody a cuddle of the team, and whilst they accommodated that, there was tension. It was, why don't you just move on attitude. And, you know, the restaurants and bars were full. Our customers were coming to see us. We're going to see customers. So I get that we have these issues here, but when you get back out into that market and see how fast they are moving, as we saw in Australia a couple of weeks ago, we've got a lot of work to do to catch up. Just for a point of reference, our business in America, we've been there for some 22 years. We will do $1 billion of turnover this year. We have 1,500 people there. Every single one of them know what a Kiwi is, who the All Blacks are, and how to eat lamb. 79 branches and a footprint of about 750,000 square metres, or as they would talk about, 7.5 million square feet. I understand, Minister, things about climate and what needs to be done, and the reference to Tesla and electric vehicles. We can't get an electric truck in America. To talk to the construction people about putting in solar power and water collection off the roof is met with a dumb stare, particularly in Texas and in Atlanta. So I think there is a lot of work to do. We're trying really hard to bring the environmental standards that we place in our buildings to the market in America, but it's not easy. Our business is across domestic transport, warehousing and air and ocean. And whilst we have $1 billion of sales across that market, the market in total is $190 billion. So we have 0.5% of the market. And it brings me to a couple of points. If you want to make it in the United States, you need to be very focused on the market that you wish to be in. And if you get it half right, be prepared to meet that demand. It is a tough market to operate in. However, if you have high quality products and do a very good job in terms of servicing, it is valuable in terms of the returns. It takes time to build that scale. For us, 20 odd years of learning and finding our way in the American market is still in its infancy, and we have a lot to do, as I've said, with half a percent of the market so far. In terms of supply chain congestion, there are still issues, and the wait time, I guess, in Los Angeles, the Port of Los Angeles, is still 30 days. 55 odd vessels waiting off the port to be worked, but another 50 sitting 50 odd miles out past Catalina because they can't be counted in the port numbers as being a congestion issue. So it is a problem. East Coast is a little better. Wait time is only 5 days. But on that West Coast, we do have labour negotiations about to come midsummer, and that could well cause more supply chain issues at the port. Of more of a problem is the congestion within the US, and that's trying to move containers from the port to the customers. And that is a lack of chassis equipment, as they call it. You can wait on the wharf, you can have a booking, but you will wait upwards of 12 hours to be served to take that one container off the wharf. So chassis equipment and container equipment is in very short supply. Of course, what has exasperated that even further is the issues around Shanghai. And whilst the Shanghai port and Shanghai airport is open, trucking is a big issue getting there. And therefore, the shipping lines are blanking sailings from Shanghai to the US, and we don't see an end to that until at least mid-May, and it may well be that after Golden Week we see Shanghai reopen. However, we should not be thinking that this supply chain issue around trying to have a COVID-free environment in China will spread to some of the other ports and industrial areas within China. Air freight, and I'm here with Dame Therese. It's good to see Air New Zealand opening to New York, also to Chicago and to Houston. However, air freight space across the world is in short supply. It will increase as belly space becomes available, as more passenger aircraft begin to fly. But the Ukraine crisis has seen a shortage of freighters, and until they find their way back into the market, I think that we will have a problem with air freight rates and air freight space for some time to come. Shipping rates have reduced over the last couple of months, only 4 to 5% from their peaks in September. But I don't think that we can expect to see sea freight rates or air freight rates reduce anytime soon, and likely through to the end of 22 and into 23. The Ukraine conflict has brought issues for us as a business. We have a business in the Ukraine and in Russia. Through the efforts of our Romanian people, we were able to rescue our people out of the Ukraine, and we've had to give notice to our people within Russia, closing that office. So a difficult time, but for the supply chain market, the Ukrainians are fantastic drivers across Europe, and they've all gone back to fight for the Ukraine. So therefore, there's a shortage of drivers across Europe, bringing another issue for supply chain in Europe. So I think some of the observations in the US for us, you know, the retail stores still have empty shelves. So there is still a shortage of product. The slowness of that supply chain exasperating that now with the closure of Shanghai. You know, they did have negative GDP growth in the month of March. But to us, it's still vibrant, and there's still plenty of things to do. So I guess just to sum that up, I expect shipping and air congestion with inflated rates to continue through 22 and into 23. The Shanghai closure is causing bigger issues than what we have elsewhere around the world. And I think a message, I suppose, to the government, Damien, let's not forget about logistics as a business that's in the United States. We're proud to be there. But thinking that we will solve the global supply chain issues with yet another study here in New Zealand is fanciful. We should focus on trade agreements, get them up and running, focus on investing in transport and rail in this country, and allow the market, the shipping lines and the customers to actually fix the global supply chain issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Our last member on the panel is Dame Therese Walsh. Dame Therese has had an exciting and diverse career, ranging from leading major sports organisations through to her current governance career. She chaired TVNZ for a period and has been a director of a wide range of New Zealand corporates. Prior to, she was head of New Zealand for the International Cricket World Cup in 2015, Chief Operating Officer for Rugby 2011, and was previously also CFO at the Rugby Union. She now chairs Air New Zealand, where she's experienced the sharp end of the pandemic, and I think if one major New Zealand corporate has really felt what it means when a pandemic strikes, I think it is Air New Zealand. Things just stopped, and it was very difficult. The airline had to shutter many operations and lose a third or so of the staff. But I think when I think about Dame Therese, I mean, she's brought calm leadership to the governance of the airline, and it must have been at times nail-biting and frustrating in the extreme, and a very long period to get to recapitalisation, which I'm sure had its stresses. But however, it's now in that process, it's in the eye of international investors again, and as Don said, Air New Zealand is reopening to the world, and particularly in the United States, the new direct flight to New York, but also going to Chicago and Houston again. And this also will help to underpin businesses' re-engagement with the United States, so it is welcome. She also chairs a bank and has been on, or still is, on MFAT's International Advisory Panel, and is also well placed, therefore, to comment on the global economic environment. So please welcome Dame Therese.
I'm a bit shorter than Don. Much better looking though, so it's all okay. I'm just going to put this down here. Mona mihi mai, Fran, and kia ora koutou e homa, kei te kōtanako kua tai mai nei, I runga I te kaupapa o te rānei, ara ko te New Zealand-US Business Summit. Greetings to you all. I'm very happy to be here today and to be invited. And a special greeting, he tēnā mihi kia koutou rangatira mā, to all our VIP guests here today, and a special call out to Minister O'Connor, to Michael Barnett, and to Fran for all their mahi to make today happen. And to Myron and Don, my fellow panellists, great to be here alongside you today, and a special shout out to Table 1, which is looking great. Very energetic table there. I'm looking for some energy, everyone. Thank you. As Fran said, I come here today with some comments from both an airline and a financial services or banking perspective. The one thing I just want to comment on is that, as Fran said, Air New Zealand is in the middle of, we're just closing off a very significant capital raise, which means I've signed my life away to lawyers around the world, and I am in no way allowed to express any opinions about anything that is occurring in relation to Air New Zealand. However, I've not been prohibited from smiling, so sometimes I might smile, which you can read into that what you wish. So that'll be my way forward. And I am excited and smiling today because today we've opened the borders to the visa waiver countries rather, and also, that means the US, and that means we're on our way to opening our flagship route in New York later in the year. So it is a very exciting time. Now, you are going to hear from our Air New Zealand CEO, Greg Foran, later in the day, and trust me, you are in for a treat. When I was interviewing Greg for the role as CEO of Air New Zealand, his stories of the US came through thick and fast. His knowledge is broad and deep. And one of the benefits of having him in the role is that I've learnt a lot about the US market. And his relationships, in particular into the US airlines, has been invaluable for Air New Zealand, in particular as we're in this restart mode. We have had a hard couple of years, and there's been a couple of moments where we've needed light relief, and in those moments, the game that we play is that I say to Greg, have you ever met, and then I insert the name of a famous American person, so think Ellen DeGeneres, Mark Zuckerberg, Reese Witherspoon, whoever you like, and invariably the answer will be yes, and I will hear a very interesting story. So in the Q&A, if you run out of topics, just put your hand up and say the most famous person you know in the US, and you might have some fun. Now, given I'm in a good mood and I'm smiling, don't tell any lawyers, I'm going to take some chair prerogative and I'm going to give away some additional flights. So there's going to be some flights at the end of the day. There's also those in the bag, which Don will now display to you to his left. There is a bag there, and if you win that bag, you will also get 2 flights to the US in a class that I'm unaware of until you open the envelope. It might be cargo, might be premium economy, I couldn't say. And what we'll do is Don and Fran will help me later in the session. We'll give them away to the people here that enjoy Myron, Don, and my presentations the most. So over to you, Don and Fran will help me choose. Anyway, that's where we are with everything today. Now, I want to stick with the airline theme, and I want to talk to you about some of the things you've heard today. So we all know there are heightened geopolitical tensions. We all know that we're dealing with some global economic conditions that are quite unusual, and we all know we don't know how they're going to play out. Don gave us an excellent summary of some really specific supply chain issues and how those are bubbling to the surface. We know all those things. I guess what's happening, though, is that in each industry, and we've just heard from the logistics industry, those things are presenting in very different ways. And so if you get a bit more granular per industry, they are bubbling up in very specific ways. And what we're also seeing is the intersection of industry to industry as those things happen. So I've got an airline hat on. If you're an airline that operates in Europe at the moment, then the Russian and Ukrainian airspaces are not places to go. What that means is that there's some significant flow on and systemic kind of impacts for that in terms of airline capacity, in terms of tourism, in terms of people wanting to visit Europe, etc., etc. Then you add parts of Asia being slow to the kind of COVID recovery piece, in terms of access for tourists, etc. And you've got a really, really interesting scenario. And what that means is that people are flooding to the US and people are flooding to other markets. It also puts a whole lot of supply chain tensions on aircraft manufacturer. So you've got airlines around the world, and in particular pockets, sort of going extremely well. Their markets are hot, and yet the ability to gain additional aircraft to help with meeting that demand and that capacity is actually really, really tricky. And again, back to Don's issue around the freighters. Now, we have somehow, in the chaos of COVID in the last 2 years, put together a new Air New Zealand strategy. We call it Kia Mau. And one of the key tenets of that strategy is optimising international. And that means following the demand and growing really strong, back after the pandemic, international markets for Air New Zealand, which also assist New Zealand more generally. Now, pre-COVID, pre-Greg Foran being the CEO, pre-me being the chair of the board, Air New Zealand had made a decision to expand in North America, and New York was a key part of that. And actually, pre-COVID, it was always known that Australia was the #1 tourism market for New Zealand, inbound tourism market. That was starting to lose, Australia was starting to lose its place on its perch at that time. We were starting to see a significant number of moments where the US was outstripping Australia. And so, circle forward, we are in the middle of the pandemic and we re-evaluate our strategy. We re-look at it with an independent lens and with the help of independent aviation experts. And guess what? All the things, same things stacked up. If not, they were highlighted. So the US and North America in general were incredibly important to Air New Zealand. What do I know about American tourists? I know 3 things. I know they spend a lot more money than tourists from other parts of the world. We know they like to get out into nature and the great outdoors, and we know that they are more likely than other tourists to go to regional New Zealand and outside of kind of our main urban centres. So once we challenged all of that, and just recently we have actually put in place some more research, and that is telling us that at the moment there are 31 million Americans actively considering New Zealand for their next holiday, and 3/4 of those are looking to do it within 6 months of border openings. So there's all this anecdotal and actually analytical evidence that points to the fact that travel demand from the US is going to go gangbusters. Now, I hope all 31 million don't come at once, because I'm not sure we're quite ready. But one of the other things, which is sort of a market-oriented thing, is that US airlines are either on making profits now in this last quarter or are forecasting to make profits in the next quarter. You compare that with Air New Zealand, we're forecasting around an $800 million loss this year, and we certainly will be loss-making for a little while. So it's quite incredible to see that shift happening after such a difficult time. We've got a US board member, Larry Deshawn, on the board of Air New Zealand. He is an airline expert, and he lives in Naples, Florida. I've never been, but apparently it's a tourist hotspot. And from our perspective, he has said that Naples, Florida, has broken tourism records every month, or almost every month, since July 2021. So that's extraordinary. You can just see the level of pent-up demand. The US are moving, and they are spending, and we need to be a part of that. So it doesn't mean Air New Zealand won't be flying to Asia or other parts of the world, but it means that we are, in a sense, doubling down in North America. And maybe, I think there's a slide, it might be the next slide, I'm not sure if I'm driving, but there's a slide that shows you all the places that we are and will be building back to this year. We are building back. Cargo is a big part of what we're doing at the moment and will continue to do, but also in terms of passenger services and those premium leisure services that the North American market likes so much. So it's quite hard. I've learnt that you don't just take a wide-bodied jet out of the desert and 2 weeks later pop over to the US. You actually have a lot of work to do and a lot of people that you need to bring back. So it's an operation that is building up throughout 2022, but by the end of the year, I would hope that things we're kind of back to where they were, and we were in a good place to service all that demand. New York, just for a moment, if we move to the next slide, which is a beautiful picture of New York. New York is obviously an exciting part of that. Now, one thing you might not know is that pre-pandemic, without a direct route service between New Zealand and New York, from Air New Zealand, New York still provided us with the third largest number of inbound tourists from the US after California and Texas, which is quite significant. And so we're really looking forward to getting into that market, and we know Kiwis like to fly direct and not muck around, so that's going to be fabulous. Just one more minute before Fran gives me the sign. I just want to talk about what we're seeing in the financial services sector. And I think the thing we're seeing in the financial services sector really reflects comments that others have made today. Increasingly, our customer base, our clients, are coming to us and wanting to do business in the US. They are moving away from other markets that are deemed unsafe, uncertain, insecure in many different ways based on all of the things that we've been talking about today. So it's being explored. It is a difficult market. It is, and Don's already referred to that. There are multi-layered distribution models, there are compressed margins, there are a range of things that make it quite complex to enter that market as a new business. And that's something we are turning our minds to in terms of how we can get there. But one thing is very clear: product origination or provenance, which is where New Zealand can excel around climate change. We had the beef example earlier today. That reputation lends itself to this market, and so we need to help people. Supply chains are making this difficult, whether it's import or export, because people are having to think, how can I handle supply chain issues? I've got to make larger, lumpier purchases. I need cash flow support. I need all of these things to make things work for my business. Just going to summarise with kind of 3 points. One is that there is a significant opportunity here, and from an Air New Zealand perspective, it is really our North Star in terms of as we build back from the pandemic. One thing that's really important is New Zealand being consistent and ongoing with its response to COVID and the certainty that inbound tourists can feel and businesses can feel interacting with this country. So I think we're well placed for that at the moment, but staying the course is critical. The last thing is that, and it's a thing that's often overlooked, and I know there's a lot of conjecture about COVID responses in different countries and different markets, who's doing it best, who did it faster, slower, whatever the case may be. One of the things that's incredibly important to the American market is security. So security means physical security, it means absence of crime, it means ability to be looked after if there's an accident and I need to go to hospital, and now it means, will I be safe in relation to COVID? So all of those aspects need to be taken together and thought about. And finally, I'd like to see lots of sway in kiwi fruit, and I'd like to see the Prime Minister being in the US permanently, because we need all the exposure we can get. We need to tell the New Zealand story in great quantities in the US. And actually, I'm not really supposed to say this, but I'm sort of working with the Minister of Finance, Grant Robertson, to lead a business delegation over to New York specifically on one of our first flights, so we can actually just really take in the New York experience in its totality and deal, have interactions with businesses there that we might be doing export with or have import opportunities with as well. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm not allowed to say it because it hasn't been signed off by the Prime Minister, but every time I see her, I mention it and she smiles at me, so I think it's already been approved. So I'll let Grant know that. But anyway, looking forward to that. So nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou.
I think we might need some more, do we need some more of these? Have you got one or? Oh, no, you have. They've got me mic'd up. They've got me on now. Thank you very much. I was a bit worried there for a moment. Hey, thank you very much for the panel, and how exciting that that the secret is out in the open, Dame Therese, that you're going to take one of those fantastic planes up to New York. How long does it take to get there, by the way, and how long to get back?
So, anywhere between 16 and 18 hours, depending on the wind. Probably take you longer to get back than it will to get there, but let's put it this way, you're going to need to have a good sleep en route.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Sounds like we will hear more about it, no doubt, in short order from the Deputy Prime Minister as well, which will be good. And isn't that exciting, ladies and gentlemen? And the Prime Minister is going to take her own mission up to the West Coast. She will go to New York, where she'll meet with tourism and investment folk, as I understand it, and then to Harvard, and then later in the year there'll be more missions, your own particular trip as well. I think that really is starting to put New Zealand back on at least the United States stage in a very critical way, and I do hope that a lot of publicity comes your way. And the point that Don made earlier about those rather desperate folk who didn't know about us, maybe they should interview your folk next time round. And you could let David Downs from New Zealand Story know that, because that's one of his, by the way, not ours. But I think that image needs to change, and this could be an exciting year for making that change. Before I go to the floor, and I'm not quite certain how this is going to be, whether where will the slider go, just for my own? If people are good, that's okay. Because when I bring Myron in, I don't want to see Myron there. I want to see the Slido questions there, because my memory is not that good to take 5 or 6 questions on board at once. But I will pass to you first, Myron, and I'll take a few questions from the floor because they are piling up. And then after that, I'm just going to have a conversation with the panel on a few issues as well. So, Myron, I think one of the questions that come up, which really does resonate, and it's from Stephen Jacoby, who is a colleague of yours from many, many years now, working on trade issues. And he is saying, is it feasible that the US could abolish tariffs on steel and aluminium to those like New Zealand who are willing to step up and embrace the I can't pronounce that, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? There you go. Myron.
Well, Fran, when I started, I did not properly thank New Zealand Inc. and, of course, the American Chamber for this wonderful conference. And, you know, I've already learned a few things. I was shocked to hear there are 31 million Americans thinking about going to New Zealand. I have to tell you, I don't think there are 31 million Americans who knew where Ukraine was on a map prior to the conflict. So that's quite an astonishing figure. And let's make sure the U.S. Chamber, the largest business organization in the world, is helping you get to 31 million quickly. And that's from someone who has experience flying Air New Zealand. And Donna, you had some interesting stories as well about the challenges of doing business in the United States. I remind everyone in the audience, the United States is still the most attractive market in the world because we are not only the most dynamic, if you can make it in the United States, you can make it anywhere. And the scale is impressive, the distribution, the rule of law does work despite the politics in Washington, and many other factors I could get into if I was getting into granular detail. But Fran, to your question, many of your audience don't know I was a trade lawyer for many years before I moved into this business. And one of the areas I used to promote was the utilization of the 232 tariff regime. And I did that when I was representing steel and representing anti-friction bearing companies, Torrington and Timken, in the United States. Today, I have a very different view. The abuse of the use of the 232 action with our allies around the world has caused huge challenges on prices for consumers and users of steel product. This despite the fact that the world did not need another inflationary tool. With the utilization of tariffs, of course, has been problematic, and that fact that we have not removed it. Now, we have made progress, Fran, you know this, with Europe in removing those tariffs. We've also cut deals with Korea and other countries. But we have not finished removing steel and aluminum tariffs. We ought to finish the job. The administration does not go a week without me telling either the National Security Advisor, a good friend of mine, Jake Sullivan, or Secretary Raimondo, the need to remove these tariffs. And I do believe that even beyond those 232 tariffs, we need to remove the 11,000 tariff items that exist between the United States and China, despite the challenges we face in that relationship. So I expect further progress. I expect that the administration will continue to make roads here, but they haven't gone fast enough and deep enough in those elimination of those tariffs.
Thank you. A quick question here to Don, and that's why has the Ukraine crisis reduced the number of freighters? Are there really high numbers of major freight companies owned by Russia or Ukraine?
Those freighters have been removed because they're Russian aircraft, and therefore they've been impounded in airports all around the world or have been forbidden to fly. If you think about air freight in general terms, pre-COVID, passenger or belly space was 50% and freighter work was the other 50%. So removing those freighters is causing issues, and it will do for Air New Zealand. What I think is a good thing, and I'm sure Dame Therese will agree with me here, that cargo has finally made it to the boardroom. You know, cargo kept Air New Zealand moving, and it's probably kept a lot of those other airlines moving too. And now it's seen as a really, really important part of the global freight strategy. And, you know, whilst passenger, the research that we've seen is that normal passengers will be back to 19 levels by 2025. I'm not sure if you see it that same way, Therese. But air freight, is likely to be 30% more by 2025. So therefore, we would encourage Air New Zealand to invest in a few more freighters, as well as more belly space. And whilst the US market is an important market for all of us, I'm not quite sure that the decision not to go to Europe or to continue with Europe is the right one. And we'd like to see you back there as well. Thank you.
I think you deserve a response.
Oh, gosh. So I think a couple of things in descending order of importance. So the first thing is that I totally agree with Don that the cargo strategy throughout COVID was critical. It was critical to keeping Air New Zealand solvent. It was critical to keeping our supply chains open. It was critical to getting masks into the country, etc. But the thing it highlighted, and that was the thing that I think scared a lot of us, was how vulnerable we are as a country because of our geographical position. And supply, and that's why there's a focus, you know, whatever you're into from a strategy perspective on that side of things, it's highlighted that we are vulnerable as a country if that is not as strong as it needs to be. And so, yeah, Air New Zealand has to play a role in that. Our cargo strategy is forming up at the moment because this has taught us a lot. And you're right, Don, it is right there in the boardroom. It's right there at every layer of the conversation. And we need to be doing as much as we can. And so we have learned a lot about our cargo operation. And I'll leave that there. But in terms of flying to Europe, yeah, that's been a very contentious topic. But we do have an excellent alliance relationship with United Airlines, who will happily drop you into London. But yeah, look, that's a tricky one. I know there's a lot of Kiwis here who have grieved that route.
Yeah. I think at this time, Myron, it'd be quite good to bring you in again, because Don had painted quite a picture of relative stasis in the United States when it comes to supply chain, both as a result of Shanghai, but also what was happening anyway. And I'd like to get your thoughts on that and how that might play out in the US and what your own forecasting of that business environment looks like.
Well, look, there are a number of factors. Don talked about the shutdown in Shanghai, and while the Xi government is certainly making changes in its policy as we have this forum today, the fact is what he referenced in terms of trucks and build up demand is continuing to cause trouble. And, you know, I see that not quite as stark as he does, but I do see that as a factor in how we look at our economic outputs for the coming year. Certainly the economy is slowing down in certain ways, and inflation is playing a big factor in that, but so is supply chain blockages. The Russia dynamic, which we haven't given enough attention to, the Russia-Ukraine dynamic, we're talking about a country that is only $1 trillion in an economy. I think New Zealand wishes it was that large. But the fact is that when you think about wheat and metals and minerals, and you think about oil and energy, it's having a huge impact, not just in Europe and the United States, but also in emerging economies around the world. And that has some impact as well as on economic forecasts. So contributing to that is a sense of a reassessment of supply chains. You're hearing more and more, not just about nearshoring and reshoring, but friendshoring. This is a new term of art in the United States about assigning with our friends a new way to deal with supply chain resiliency challenges and blockages. And I think here is an opportunity for the Kiwis to be a part of that equation as we think about friendshoring. However, and this is my caveat quickly, is, U.S. companies doing business, and I represent a lot of large companies and small and medium-sized enterprises as well. And when I talk to CEOs of major U.S. companies, they're not abandoning China, but they are placing bets on other markets, Vietnam, Mexico. Obviously, there are countries that I visited in Latin America that like to get a piece of that action, other countries in Southeast Asia. And if I'm in the freight cargo business, if I'm in the shipping business, I'm recognizing some supply chain diversification. I'm recognizing that manufacturing will shift a little bit. And this will have, over a long term, huge ramifications for the way trade circulates. We are, of course, very mindful of this, and we are counseling our companies not to overestimate the damage from the Russia-Ukrainian situation, but not to underestimate the growing tensions in the U.S.-China relationship as it relates to the supply chain dynamics.
Thank you, Myron. Don, I mean, you've got operations also obviously in China and clearly the United States and elsewhere, but how are you balancing what Myron's talking about the potential bifurcation of supply chains?
Oh, we are seeing that diversification. I mean, certainly Vietnam, Southeast Asia has taken the opportunity to manufacture more. But I still think that globalization is here with us. I think resources, capital, labour, skills, labour shortages will still mean that we move a lot of freight around the world, and China and Southeast Asia remains an important part of that process. For us, definitely the Southeast Asian sector is an area that we're smaller in and weaker in, and we're busy moving to increase the size of that business. We'll open Jakarta in Indonesia in July, and look to open other branches as we can get out and about travelling.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about some of the issues that stare us in the face right now. And these are hard things for business to balance and navigate through. But I wonder, Don, I mean, you're an optimistic person. You've talked about going to the United States, saying it's vibrant, the bars are full, that your team don't like you wearing a mask. It's sort of like get with the program. Where do you see those pockets of optimism taking you, I mean, for your business?
I mean, we've got a lot to do in that US market. I mean, we're only 0.5% of what's available to us, and we clearly will be very defined about what part of the transport and logistics market that we work in. But the US is likely to be the biggest growth market for us over the next 5 years. Europe will follow that. And, likewise, Asia continues to be exciting for us. Do we get ourselves to India? Do we get ourselves into the Middle East, Africa, and South America? Yes, at times, but so much to do in those big markets. And as Myron has been saying, it is a dynamic market. I'm not necessarily think he's right about how easy it is to operate there. And, we've made some mistakes thinking that we should headquarter ourselves in California. And I think, in advice perhaps to those in the room and those watching, I would be thinking differently about that now. If we had our second chance, we would be looking at Midwest or East Coast, because that's where the population is. And, California is just a little bit too far. And all due respect to the airlines, we don't need to be on those planes as often as we are getting to that market.
Well, Don, Fran, can I just jump in quickly?
Yes, way you go.
Because I have to be optimistic, because I represent the U.S. Chamber and I have for a long time. But I would say this. One is we do have talent and worker shortage issues in our country. These are significant. They go well beyond issues around engineers or whether we have enough engineers and scientists. It goes into construction and people working in restaurants and bars. These are big issues for our economy to wrestle with and front and center in the minds of CEOs in our country. The second challenge we have is we've got to deploy the infrastructure spending appropriately, making sure that that money gets utilized to improve our physical infrastructure, whether it's roads or rail or transportation more broadly. This affects the airlines. It affects, obviously, companies that are in this room today. And frankly, it makes it more attractive if we can get in that game quickly rather than stuck in the political space that we're in. If we can deploy those funds at the state and local level, there's huge opportunities. And third, Don knows this, labor costs in certain parts of the country are much cheaper, and taking advantage of our market, because just like I wouldn't say Africa is one country, you wouldn't say the United States is one state. California has certain regulatory and labor challenges for companies operating there for the first time, but other states may have more attractive tax and labor and other advantages. So knowing the market in the United States is very important. And often people make the mistakes, and they think the United States is this big, huge market. It is, but you have to know where to go, and you have to get localized and support, just like you have to do in any other market. That's the reality of our country. And once you figure it out, it's a very attractive place. And for our friends in Kiwis, do please come.
I think this is an issue that we share in New Zealand, obviously, and one of the areas which the Prime Minister highlighted and also Minister O'Connor was the growth that is happening here, the investments by Amazon and also Microsoft into New Zealand, which does imply that we do need to have this bunch of skilled people or grow those skilled people to work in ICT. So the tech sector, and a question from the audience, is under immense pressure globally with the skill shortage. And so how do you build inclusive and affordable connectivity with global tech inflation? Because, I know just from people I know who are involved in, deep tech young enterprises in New Zealand, that young grads are being offered a huge amount of money to go to the United States, and potentially 60 or 70% more than they could get in New Zealand. And that's just basically with their basic ticket. They're not even necessarily trained up, particularly when it comes to the work interface. So I'm wondering, and this is a question for everyone, because we've heard about the working from anywhere culture, we've heard about the great need for these people. How do we address that? How do we build people, and also from our perspective, people who will stay here? And I wonder, Therese, is that something you would have a thought on?
I'll have a crack, and I'm sure the others will have views as well. I mean, look, talking about both the tech sector itself as well as tech kind of team members in your organisations, I would say this is something that is discussed every meeting in boardrooms right now. This is right up the top of the list. I don't have a brilliant answer for you, Fran, because I don't think there is a brilliant answer right now. But there are a number of things that I think are coming into play, and I think one of them is that there have to be good incentives from an economic perspective in country, and we've got some, but we need more. Secondly, this work from anywhere thing that's come out of COVID is quite helpful. There are a number of people, as we're looking to fill roles, and look for talent around the world. There are a number of people attracted to coming here, potentially living in the regions and actually being a part of what is happening. So I think we have to highlight the work from anywhere, work in New Zealand, work in a, clean, green, all the rest of it that goes with kind of the perceptions of this country, and we have to do that. But at an organisational level, the thing we're all looking to do is sort of distinguish ourselves based on purpose. I think the PM made these comments earlier today. You've got social inequality and all these things, and actually the next generations, my children who are in the workforce, want to work for organisations that are doing good. Yeah, make money as well, that's great, but also do good. So I think we have got a role to play in that as well. So like I say, no one clear answer from my perspective.
How do you perceive it, John?
I'm not sure we are one of these industries that want our people working from anywhere. We've got 25 countries that we can get them around, I guess. Our view is we get them early, take young graduates, provide them with a career, and if that bent is towards tech, helping us develop automation in our warehouses, drones running around the warehouse at night doing stock taking, feeding it back into our software, then that's the stuff that gets them up every morning. But we want them getting up and coming to the freight dock, seeing the freight, understanding what it means. So for us, that's also about culture, and I get that this generation needs to feel that we're in, they're with organisations that are doing the right things. But unless they're there at the desk, understanding those things that the business is doing, they get somewhat lost from home. And it is interesting, in this US market, we've had probably more resignations from those that now only want to work from home. And we've accepted those resignations. We get that that's the individual's choice, but for us, we need them at their desk, on the freight dock, in the warehouse, doing the work in terms of air and ocean, to create this culture that's so important to us.
I think, sorry, Fran, just one other point to make, which lends itself to the resignation part. The US unemployment rate at the moment, I mean, all the advanced economies in the world are seeing, you know, inflation and all these things, but the US, it's come about in a slightly different way. And in terms of their COVID response, so they've got this they've gone from incredibly high to incredibly low unemployment in a very short period of time. And one of the things that's going to actually inhibit, both on the tech side but also generally, because Air New Zealand is trying to staff up, is that there's 1.8 jobs for every American right now. So how are we going to be productive, even if we have got the right trade kind of settings? That's actually going to be really challenging in every industry, is getting the people on the ground there to do what needs to be done. So it's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, how is the Chamber strategising in this area, I guess, Myron? I mean, these are pretty phenomenal metrics.
Well, Fran, this is one of the top issues for us to grapple with. We have, as I said, worker shortages. We have a workforce, that, particularly the youth that Don has talked about, that wants more flexibility, and Therese has talked about wants more flexibility. There's more agility, so there's some upside to that. No one in the United States, unless it's sort of the requirement of their particular sector, is moving to a 5 days a week in-person office environment. We certainly are not operating that. We're operating 2 days a week. We'll probably move to 3 at some point. That is probably going to be the standard response across industries, but not all industries, as Don makes the point. Depends on the utility of the service that you're providing. But it is creating a new challenge in dealing with the youth that don't feel as loyal. They're not in to stay for as long. They want a more flexible lifestyle. I think actually that plays well for our friends in New Zealand, who may not have scale market but have quality of life to offer. And so there is a sense that you can work remotely, and working remotely does not mean state to state. It can mean country to country. And I think you're seeing that in our workforce. The other attributes about how we scale up is a big issue. We have skills that we badly need. What do I think we need to do? We need to have an immigration policy that makes sense in our country. We don't have one currently, and we can't get the two sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, together on this. But this is a crisis in the United States. Without a good immigration policy, we are leaving people who want to come into our country, get educated, and work, and create the new Amazons and the new eBays and the new, Googles, and we're preventing those opportunities. So we have challenges. We do have a low unemployment rate, but don't be fooled. That's because, in part, some people have chosen not to go back in what we call traditional workforce. So the unemployment is actually causing us to have huge challenges in meeting jobs. And as has already been alluded to, we are short about 2.5, 3 million jobs that need to be filled. That's huge, and that's significant, and it's a growing challenge in our country. So huge top of mind issue for CEOs in our country, and something we think about. The only thing I want to end on, Fran, is 2 other points. I don't think the United States and China we're spending enough time talking about. The trade piece is less complicated than the technology piece. What we are going to see is a Cold War on technology, and I'm worried about it. I'm worried about how standards are developed. I'm worried about how regulatory practices are developed. I'm worried about companies that feel that they want to do business in both China and the United States and how they hedge their bets. So this dichotomy that is developing, this Cold War mentality on technology is coming. And it's coming hard and fast. There are going to be new export controls, more outbound investments coming from the US government. China is going to respond in a muscular way. This is huge problems for companies who are operating in both markets. So we need to watch that. The second thing is the drift between Europe and the United States in developing the right standards around AI and emerging technologies. Another big issue, and if I'm sitting where you are in New Zealand, I want to make sure that I'm not cut off from the European market, I'm not cut off from the US market or China. But we don't have similar standards yet developed to deal with AI and emerging technologies. We're seeing divergences in policies with Europe adopting things like the DMA and other measures that are frankly very problematic for business leaders who want certainty, clarity, and conciseness when they deal with the different markets that are so significant for their business operations.
Panel have a comment on that?
I would add cybersecurity. And maybe Myron was referring to that, but that's certainly a major issue now. And, you know, we're seeing it across the logistics sector where a number of customers and or players are being hit. I think the Russia-Ukraine crisis has got a part to play in that. But it's certainly an area that's of concern, and you need to be all over it.
Yeah, cyber is a component of it, not all of it, but a big part of it.
And I'd just add, I mean, I totally agree with both. Cybersecurity is right up in lights, but when you talk about digital trade, and you know, if I take a financial services example like open banking, we're going down all these roads, which is the natural way for us to go and to differentiate ourselves. But gosh, it's troubling where that's all going to land, because I agree with the Cold War from a data, digital, and cyber perspective.
I mean, just take that a little bit further, Myron. I mean, how do you actually see the political environment in Washington and the ability to cope with these challenges? Is it functional? And what is the real risk at the midterms to the Biden presidency?
Well, it's functional in the sense that we have work to do in this country, and you have no choice but to address the inflation challenge in our country, the supply chain shortages. You're seeing in the United States Congress a bill going through called the Competes Act, or USICA. That's an important effort to support the semiconductor industry. Has some challenges with it that I don't need to get into. But there is a recognition we have to get our game in order in the United States in a lot of areas: infrastructure, immigration, tech policy, obviously talent issues. But where I am concerned, again, is the emergence of what I call new rules around data localization, around cross-border data flows, around custom clearance issues that deal with various ways to price out electronic transmissions, with the issue around clearly government procurement, the inability of governments to create the right kind of level playing field, the discriminatory standards that are being developed in countries, including in India, China, and Europe, and to some extent, and the lack of coherent approach in the United States. So the politics in Washington is one part of it, but frankly, states are starting to adapt the privacy standards. We should have a national privacy standard, right? Just like we should have had a national insurance policy. Now we have all these states that are brokering deals. And that's going to make it much more challenging for business. It's going to add a cost. It's going to cost more for businesses. And so we have fragmentation in our market. Europe has what I consider draconian measures at some point. And I think fortress China. And these are the three big markets of the world. And, you know, we've seen a slowdown at some point in Europe. And obviously the energy issues contribute to that. We're seeing a slowdown in China. We've seen somewhat of a slowdown in the United States, although hopefully will return in 23. But these are all huge draws on the global economy. So this is a major set of challenges. But Fran, look, Our politics are broken in Washington. They need to be fixed. We do not have enough people in the center, on the right and the left, willing to work together, and we're beginning to get polarized on both the right and the left, and it's a huge problem. Period.
If I could just make a point, somebody texted me earlier to say that they thought the Prime Minister's clarity on trade was such that it's a pity that her speech wasn't providing the talking points for USTR.
Well, Fran, look, I've had wonderful conversations for a year and a half with Ambassador Tai, and you're going to hear Kirk Campbell be a little bit more forward-leaning in this section or session with you guys. The bottom line is, look, we can't have a WTO functioning. We can't have global trade rules if the United States is not actively at the table helping to negotiate it. And I thought the Prime Minister's comments in suggesting that in a more diplomatic fashion was right on. We need to speak with authority, and we need to speak with conviction. And most importantly, we need to back it up with action.
Yeah, and just a question from the floor, taking that point a little bit further. And with the fact that you touched on the need for US leadership on international trade. So how do we build political support for liberalisation despite rising protectionism?
Well, it's a challenge. I mean, look, we have some obligations in the business community. We shouldn't run away from our own obligations, and others can comment on it. I mean, the bottom line is that we don't do enough public talking about the benefits of trade. It's, it's funny when you poll Americans and you say, is trade good? They'll say it's good. But when you poll them about trade agreements, they'll not come down the same way. And I think we have done a poor job, our leaders have done a poor job of educating Americans. There are 40 million Americans whose jobs are tied to international trade. Half of manufacturing in the United States is exported. Almost half of agriculture produced in the United States is exported. We are the #1 producer of energy, and yet we're not exporting enough of it around the world. We just need to figure out our own problems at home, and part of it is our politicians having the courage to speak out. And that is something that has to change. And frankly, we've been running in the United States for 2 years on a domestic agenda until we got into this problem in Europe, with the exception of maybe the Afghan pullout, which we don't need to talk about, and the dynamic with China. Most of the administration has been focused on domestic priorities. But part of being strong as a nation is leading by example for the world. And yes, we have to do more at home, but we can't just think about home. We have to be a part of the global system. So I feel very strongly we should speak out more about this. I think Kirk Campbell does as well, but not enough people in the U.S. government and in the U.S. Congress are speaking out with such conviction.
Sobering. Look, just briefly before I come back to the panel, there is a question, one more question for you here from Stephen Jacoby, which asks, what does Ambassador Tai mean when she talks about worker-centred trade policy?
I'm supposed to be polite at these moments, right? Look, she's been talking about a labor-centric policy since the onset. I'm all for labor and American labor and American manufacturers and American farmers and American consumers all being stakeholders in a consultation process to advance a trade agenda. But I'm not for using a lot of words to escape the reality. We have not launched a new trade agreement in a decade. Let me remind that audience, not one new trade agreement in a decade. Now, we were obviously fans of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and now CPTPP. We were never a part of RCEP, but we have got to get back in the game. And so how do you do that? You go forward with negotiations that existed with UK and Kenya. You launch forward with the IPAF initiative, which isn't perfect. You find a way to provide market access. I think there's more support on Capitol Hill than Ambassador Tai realizes to do something on market access to get Vietnam and other countries in. And you start to relieve Americans of the tariffs that have been imposed that are causing huge challenges. And by the way, I know it's not Europe, but I just paid $5 for gas. Now that's huge. And when I hear about all the travel that could take place Let me tell you, Americans travel and use their cars.
Well,
$5 for gas is not acceptable. When we have the largest supply of oil and gas in the world, we ought to be doing something about it. Anyway, stop ranting.
I think
for
your
this
fellow
argument.
panelists have some views on that, so yeah. Come on, Don.
Try paying for it here, mate.
Yeah.
What he said.
I'm just going to, just because there is a question here that it's addressed to Dame Therese, but I'll also put it to Don. And it talks about, can you share a good story or highlight from the last 2 years of uncertainty?
Oh, look, I could share so many stories of the last 2 years. In fact, if you had a couple of hours spare, it'd be good therapy for me. Look, one that's just a bit of a light-hearted one is that very early on, like I'm going to say a few days after Greg Foran started as the CEO of Air New Zealand, this COVID thing was gaining a bit of traction. It went from just being a vague thing over in Asia to a thing. And it was a Saturday, and I was still under the vague illusion I was allowed private time. And I went to a day spa to get a pedicure. Is there anyone in the room that's ever had a pedicure at a day spa? Don? No? Anybody? No? Oh, there's a couple. There's the lady in the yellow jacket. She's got good feet. So I was sitting there and Greg rang me and he said, we've just had the news that we might not be flying to Samoa. Samoa might not let Kiwis into the country anymore. And we both went, well, that's just unbelievable. Imagine the impact on our business. This is horrendous. I said, no, this can't be true. We won't let that happen. So, and of course, at this point, Greg didn't know anyone in New Zealand. So while I was having my pedicure, I rang the Deputy Prime Minister, I rang the CEO of MFAT, Chris Seed, I rang the CEO of DPMC, I rang every person in the Wellington bureaucratic system that I could find. And by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we had the Prime Minister of New Zealand talking to the Prime Minister of Samoa. In the end, of course, we didn't end up flying into Samoa or any other country for that matter, but it was quite a cute moment because, you know, you could see we were absolutely startled by the thought that Samoa might be off the table for us, which just seems very cute right now. But also, I think from Greg's perspective, having come from the US, and Myron, I don't know, you know, what it's like for you, but there's one line of separation here. And in fact, when I spoke to, and I think Greg was quite shocked by how within an hour all the phone calls could be made. And in fact, speaking to Grant Robertson later in the afternoon, he said, yes, no, I've been briefed as well because I bumped into, and I can't remember, Chris, if it was you or Brooke, but just at Tiaro Bakery. So I've been briefed by you from the day spa and Chris or Brooke from the bakery. So I think Greg had a lesson in how the New Zealand kind of system works. So just a light-hearted one.
I think, you know, across the whole Mainfreight world, we've had amazing stories of people standing up to be counted on behalf of our customers and doing amazing things. The Ukraine crisis, our Romanian team smuggled our team from Kiev out across the border, but not only did our team, but their mothers, their mother-in-laws, their father-in-laws, dogs and cats. And now we've got them employed in other parts of the world. All 25 of our Russian people who we've had to make redundant and close the office want to work for us somewhere else in the world. So there's been lots of good stories, small stories. I suppose a funny little story very quickly, because we had these issues with Ashley Bloomfield over the time, you know, all of us, I'm sure, and we were trying to get these rat tests in, and we had this consignment for some number of businesses, and of course everyone else's rat test was getting seconded by the Ministry of Health for their supplies or the government's supplies, and we had 1.8 million of these things in Shanghai, and I said to, I think it was Grant Robinson, if these things get snaffled by Ashley Bloomfield and his team, you've got trouble, I tell you. And he said, I'll get Ashley to give you a call. And I thought, oh yeah, that'll be right. Anyway, sure enough, Friday afternoon, he rings me up. Hi Don, and Happy New Year, another new variant. And I thought, this guy's actually got humour. I quite like it. And anyway, I was busy explaining to him, whilst he was telling me he wouldn't pinch the 1.8 million rat tests that we had on order. I said, look, we have to ship them from Shanghai to southern China to get the air freight space, because Air New Zealand didn't have enough planes on the ground to get them into New Zealand in time. And I said, we're really worried about the thieves that could take these things from us on a trucking journey. He said, what? There is worse thieves than the Ministry of Health?
I like that.
He's got humour.
That's a good story. A quick light-hearted moment from you, also Myron, and then we're going to close.
Well, there are so many moments. Look, I am impressed by the dedication of people in Ukraine that have really come through this with such strong resiliency. And I hear stories all the time. We have an American chamber that operated in Ukraine, just like we have Mike Hearn and Michael Burnett in New Zealand. We have an AmCham in Ukraine that had to evacuate people. We have provided for those people so that they could leave the country and also take care of their families. There's so many lighthearted stories, but I have to, Fran, just say something that's a little less lighthearted. This is an extraordinary time, as I said at the outset of my remarks. This is a time where there's a lot of healing that's going to be needed in Europe. There's a lot of uncertainty in global commerce. And what I would just say to everyone in this audience, this is a time when friends and allies need to stand up and be counted for. And, whether it's IPAF or some other way, I hope that the United States works very effectively with New Zealand and Australia and Japan and Singapore and other allies to overcome some of the challenges we confront together. The second point I'd make is I never forget the hospitality Michael Barnett treated to me, and most importantly, your government as well, to the people that visited for this particular forum in 2011, February of 2011. I'll never forget the hospitality and the kindness of the government and the people that were in that forum. Fran, you were there and others. And I can tell you that in all of us who have been part of this relationship over many, many years, and I've been involved for 20 plus years in this relationship, the people in Kiwi, you stand up and you make a difference, and your impact is felt well beyond the size of your country. So kudos to all of you.
Thank you very much for those gracious comments. I would really like to thank the entire panel. I think we've had a very rich conversation. It's been a privilege and it's been frank. It's been to the point, and I think, it really has put us in good stead for the rest of the day. I now call on Tim McCready to come and talk to Dame Therese and Don, who have something to share. You say.
Perhaps do you both want to go up to the lectern there and do whatever it is that you,
You've got
we'll
a microphone, Don? You got a microphone, Don?
Yeah, I got one.
Don, I guess Don and I are just looking for a visual representation of your enjoyment of our presentation. Really? Okay. All right. Don, I'm going to let you do the honours.
Only one person stood up, the lady in white.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Dame Therese, Don, Myron, and Fran for the panel. There are a lot for us all to take on board. And I think that if there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that we need more spot prizes at business conferences. So it's now time for networking over morning tea, which has been sponsored by the New Zealand International Business Forum, and that's just outside in that pre-function area. We're going to start back in here in just under 30 minutes at 10:30, so please just be ready to come back inside then for that much anticipated session with Kirk Campbell at the White House. Thanks very much.